Hello Internet, Seth Skorkowski, and today we'll be taking a look at the classic traveler scenario Annic Nova, written by Mark Miller and originally published in 1979's Journal of the Traveler's Aid Society, and again in 1980 for the first double adventure module. It's since been updated and released multiple times. The adventure is extremely influential as it was the first taste of Traveler for an entire generation of players, and for that I see it in kind of the same vein that I look at the Village of Hamlet for AD&D or The Haunting for Call of Cthulhu. Coming in at just 10 pages, the scenario is playable in a single short session, but with a few Game Master additions, it could easily become much longer than that. The adventure offers us a mystery and a derelict starship, the Annic Nova, one of the weirdest and coolest ships that I've seen. Between the various reprint art and fan art over the last 4 decades, we have a lot of pictures of the ship, many of which I will be using for this video. This one, while not the most accurate for the module, is my personal favorite. I don't know why, but there's just something about it that I really like. Now, while there's no significant changes between the various releases that I've been able to find, the version that I ran was from 2011 Signs and Portents 93, which is available on DriveThruRPG, links below. So what I'm going to do is offer my criticisms and my suggestions as a game master who has successfully run this adventure.
And I'm Jack the NPC. I'm going to be giving this one to you from a player's side of things as we get to explore my brand new starship. I do get to keep the ship after this one, right?
But before we go any further, I must warn you that there will be spoilers. So any players in the audience, please stop now. But if you ever want to experience this little piece of tabletop history, send your Game Master this way to see if Annic Nova will be a good fit for your group. Okay, Game Masters, let's get this thing started. Annic Nova is an extremely unusual adventure, and one, that it's a dungeon crawl in space as we explore this derelict starship, and 2, there really isn't a plot. At least by that, what I mean is that there isn't a villain to this scenario. The obstacle is simply exploring the ship, as well as an airborne disease that's on board, but that disease is completely contained to a single room, so unless the player characters are dumb enough to open up that quarantined room, they should be perfectly fine.
Then that quarantine is as good as broken. Player characters open up doors. It's what they do. Though there is a bit of a reverse proportion to it depending on how much the Game Master actually wants them to open it. The more they want the player characters to open up the doors, the less likely they're going to open it. And the less the Game Master wants them to open up the door, the more likely they're going to open it. And no one knows why that is. So Game Masters, the only way to guarantee that they do or do not open up that door really just depends on how much you do or don't want them to do it. So really, it's your fault.
Now, one thing that a lot of Game Masters are probably going to find frustrating about this adventure is the answers to all the questions that are raised as somebody is exploring the ship are never ever given. There's nothing inside the module that tells you exactly what happened or what a lot of this stuff means. So Game Masters are supposed to interpret this however they like, or maybe let the player characters interpret it, and that way the Game Master can kind of sit back and nod their head and go, yeah, that's exactly what it is. You're right. Very clever. But because these things have never been answered, this has led to decades and decades of various interpretations and different theories between Game Masters that they've shared back and forth for years. The adventure opens with some information about a weird ship that's been spotted several times in various locations over the past few years. No one knows anything about it because the ship jumps away before anyone can make contact with it. Now, how the player characters end up finding this ship is completely up to you. Maybe they stumble across it, like they jump into a sector and boom, there's a weird starship and it's not responding to any calls. Or maybe somebody spotted it and they sent the player characters there to investigate it. It doesn't really matter, do it however you want. For the second half of this video, I'll go ahead and share how I did this whenever I ran the adventure. The ship itself is pretty weird. She's 600 tons with a pair of laser turrets. There are a few red lights that are visible through some of the windows, but a few things about this ship should be immediately apparent to anyone looking at it. First, the irregular shape of the front is a giant folded solar collector. That's why it kind of looks like a baby bonnet. Next is a long portion that's in the middle, and this is a greenhouse with plants growing inside of it that the player characters should be able to see if they shine any light on it. Finally are the 2 pods that come off the rear, kind of like the engines of the Starship Enterprise. Now these pods aren't engines, they're actually docked pinnaces, which means that they can detach from the ship and maybe go planet side or skim a gas giant in order to get some fuel. Along the top of the ship is the name Annic Nova. One pod has Annic Nova 1 and the other has Annic Nova 5 painted on the side. The font for this writing is a bit of a hint, so that's a clue that you should tell your player characters about. So for my game, I printed these names out and handed them to my players. A scan of the ship will also discover several possible entrances that they can use to get aboard. Some of those are going to be better than others. Now, one thing to mention is that the version of the adventure that was in Signs and Portents does not show the airlocks that are on the arms extending to the pods. The interior deck plans do show them, but they're never ever mentioned as being a possible entrance to get aboard the ship. According to the original module, the starboard one is damaged from a collision with a micrometeor strike, and that requires a mechanic check in order to open it, while the port one has a 50% chance of being locked. Now, while I don't know for certain why the updated module didn't mention these as a possible entrance, I suspect it was due to the original module listed the entrances out, numbering them 1 through 5. But 5 is listed twice. I believe that was the culprit of where the error occurred whenever they did the reprint, but I could be wrong. Either way, Game Masters, since the airlocks do appear on the interior map of the ship, you should still go ahead and mention them as possible entrances whenever the player characters do their initial scan. Now, as I keep saying, the ship is pretty strange, and thankfully, due to all the great art that's out there on the internet now, I can understand one of its more interesting features. You see, the ship has no maneuver drive. Instead, one of the 2 pinnace pods can detach from the ship like so, and then it docks in the large hole that's in the back of the ship. And from there, the pinnace's thruster moves the ship. The module merely describes this process, but a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say, and seeing it really helped me understand it better when I was trying to explain all this to the players.
Excuse me, what did you say those ships were called again? You know, the long cylindrical ones?
Pinnaces.
And they go into the back of the biggest ship. What are these called again?
Pinnace. Oh. By the way, this was a real conversation that I had with my players, and it went on a lot longer than this. Now, the current edition of Highguard does include an isometric deck plan for the ship, but several major features, such as the rear dock, are absent. So I consider the Highguard version of this ship to simply be a different Annic Nova, maybe a different model of the ship, but it's not the Annic Nova. The ship interior is pretty interesting, and there is atmosphere aboard, and it is at a comfortable 25 degrees Celsius, so the player characters can get around aboard the ship without any problems, unless of course they were dumb enough to break one of the windows to get aboard, but who would do that? So there is minimal power aboard. That way, if one of the windows does get broken, one of the iris valves can cinch shut and prevent all the air from leaving the other decks of the ship. However, there is no gravity aboard the ship until the player characters can figure out how to turn on any of the power. So as they're initially exploring the ship, they're going to be doing all of this in 0 gravity. The main section of the ship is 4 decks high. Now, one clue about the alien language is that the decks are all marked with symbols that look like 1, 5, 7, and then the letter A. So to help with that, I made a handout of the elevator's number pad, and I put a link below to download all the handouts that I made just in case any game masters out there might want to use them.
You and your freaking handout addiction. I swear, how many handouts could one game master give?
Oh, we haven't even started with handouts. I also made them for the giant television controls, the different alien currencies that can be found in one of the staterooms, and also a numeric keypad for the control panel to access the turret cylinders. I figure between all that, it should be easier for the player characters to figure out the numbering system, which I think it's kind of cool when they eventually figure out that the ship's name is really just a string of weird numbers. Now, one thing with the hazards aboard this ship is that the original crew was smaller than normal humans, which means all of the iris valve doors are a little bit smaller than the player characters are used to going through, and if they're wearing vac suits, there's actually a chance that they might tear their vac suits as they're trying to go through all of these iris valves. So 2 things with this. First, if the player characters are not human themselves, such as one of the player characters is Vargar, and Vargar is smaller than normal humans, or maybe a player character is an Aslan, and Aslans are bigger than normal humans, I would adjust the difficulty for that. Either offer a boon or a bane, or just give it a +2 or a -2 to the difficulty in order to get through these valves without tearing your suit.
And second, tearing a vac suit is kind of a difficult thing to do. I mean, we're not even talking about the armored variety of vac suits spacesuits that your player characters are probably going to be sporting. So instead of just having them make an athletics check, and if they fail the athletics roll, it's like, whoops, you tore your spacesuit that's also impervious to bullets, go ahead and have it be that whatever they failed their athletics check by, the effect is how many points of damage it done to the suit. And if the suit has more points of armor than damage taken, then they don't breach the suit. But if that effect is of 6 or more, go ahead and have 1 point of damage get through the suit, and now we got a breach suit. That way it feels a little bit more fair, and the player characters that spent the extra money to get the armored spacesuits have a less chance of getting their spacesuit torn than those that didn't.
Now, the big reason that the module is trying to get the player characters out of the suits is to make them susceptible to the airborne disease. But I suggest that you just pay more attention to the air supply that's aboard their suits if they don't trust their atmospheric readers telling them that the air is perfectly fine. Go ahead and take your helmets off. Nothing can happen to you now. So instead of just trying to rip their suits and making them unusable, I would go ahead and focus my attention on the fact that most suits have between 6 to 8 hours of air, and if the player characters are exploring the starship, it's going to take them a whole lot longer than 6 or 8 hours, so they might need to take their suits off, or they might have to do this in small little legs, and then they get bored of doing this in small legs, so they finally just take their helmet off and breathe the air, and that's when the fun begins. Cracking the computer's code or learning the alien language could take several days. Now, speaking of computers, the ship's computer is this giant primitive beast, kind of like a 50s sci-fi computer. It takes up an entire room and has all these fans, and it's just big and bulky and kind of weird. So because of that, I don't think it would be unreasonable to have this alien computer a little bit more difficult to access, because its ports are nothing like the computer ports that the player characters have, such as the player characters are all on, USB and lightning adapters, while the ship's computer's port looks like it's for a PS2. So this could increase the difficulty of trying to access the computer, or it could require that one of the player characters have to fabricate some sort of adapter. Now, if their own ship doesn't have a workshop in order for them to do that, there is a nice workshop aboard the Annic Nova. One of them is specifically for electronics. So you could say there are enough parts in there in order to make the port adapters, so they've got all the spare parts they want, as well as soldering irons and everything else that they might need. This could lead to a good task chain, as you've got one player character who's making the adapter, and how well they do or don't do at it means that it's going to give some pluses or minuses to the other character that's trying to get the computer to work, and that could get more and more players involved in a task that normally would only require one player to do it. Now, speaking of adapters, the same thing goes for the docking rings aboard the ship. There are airlocks to get aboard the Annic Nova, but they probably don't fit the standardized traveler ship airlocks, which means that it could increase the difficulty in order for them to get a good seal on the ship in order to dock with it, or it might encourage them to spacewalk in order to get aboard the Annic Nova. This now means that the air supply aboard the traveler suits is even more critical, since the ships themselves aren't linked, and the player characters can spend as much time they want aboard the Annic Nova, but then they're going to have to spacewalk in order to get off of it, which just encourages them to break their suit discipline, take their helmets off, and breathe deep of that sweet, sweet corrupted air. Now, once again, a character with all the proper skills can use the workshop aboard the Annic Nova, or the workshop aboard their own ship if they have one, and fabricate some sort of airlock adapter. That way they can dock their ship to the Annic Nova without any sort of difficulty. Now, of course, all of this is going to take quite a bit of time, and the Annic Nova has a serious potential of jumping once the solar collectors have gotten enough power in order to power the jump drive. And if the crew hasn't figured out yet how to turn the jump drives off, that means it could just jump it randomly anytime that you think is dramatically appropriate. Now, personally, I think it's a great idea to have the Annic Nova jump while the travelers are aboard it, but there is a potential problem involved, and that's if not all the player characters are aboard the Annic Nova when it makes that jump. This can easily throw your entire adventure out of whack, because your PCs are all going to be separated by at least a week's time as the ship is traveling through jump space and is unable to communicate outside of it, and that could be a little bit of a bummer for those that weren't aboard the ship when that happened. And then they're going to be 2 or 3 parsecs away once the ship arrives, and player characters that are separated might not ever be able to find the Annic Nova again, or might not be able to find it till long after the adventure is over, and it's not going to be much fun for those players. So I merely suggest that you give a little bit of warning to the player characters before you do this jump on them. Give them a couple minutes to either turn the jump drive off, or maybe get all aboard the ship or get all off the ship. That way they have some sort of warning that the ship is going to jump before it actually happens, and maybe, just maybe, they can stop it. Also keep in mind that since the Annic Nova has a huge hold, it's 150 tons, and that hold is empty, that now means that the Annic Nova could carry 150 extra tons with it. So if the Traveler starship is docked to the Annic Nova and their starship is 150 tons or less, that now means that it might actually join the Annic Nova when it does that jump. Just get pulled along through the bubble of jump space and have a full week together inside jump space, and when they end up out of it, who knows where they'll be. Another suggestion, and I totally stole this from a 20-year-old post on a message board that was discussing this adventure, is the child's picture of a coiled snake on the door of the quarantined room. Maybe this seemingly dangerous snake is really a child's interpretation of a rod of Asclepius or a caduceus from all the medical gear while the original crew was trying to cure those people that were sick before they finally just shut this room off and say, nobody open up this door. Like the rest of the mystery of what happened aboard the starship, the module never tells you. And I think it would be a good answer that a game master could just keep in the back of their head. That way, if the player characters do figure out the correct answer, the GM can just smile and go, yeah, you're right, it's a caduceus.
Whoa, 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 did you just say caduceus? I knew it! This is just our old Pulp Cthulhu game coming back to haunt us, but this time it's in the distant future. Kinda like in our Conan game when caduceus stuff started popping up in the distant past. Guys, I know who is behind all of this, and it is serpent people.
Yeah, there's no serpent people here, Jack.
Yeah, that is exactly what a serpent person would want us to think. But this is all an elaborate crossover, I am sure of it.
Now, the 20-year-old discussion thread that I had mentioned is absolutely fascinating. Even the unofficial sequel adventure, Annic Nova Evacuation, lends much of its inspiration to that particular thread, so I'll post a link below to it. Okay, so now that we've gone over what's actually inside the module, as well as a couple suggestions on my part, let me go ahead and tell you how I ran this adventure when I did it. Maybe that can help inspire some of the other game masters out there to either use some of these ideas or improve them, or maybe come up with their own and use those instead. But one word of warning is I did make a few aggressive changes to the original module to make it fit better with our group. The group is approached by an older gentleman, a Dr. Darius Numar. He was commissioning them with some sort of treasure hunt in mind, and he was searching for an elusive alien starship that he spent the last 15 years hunting for. He tells them that he was once part of a crew that had located the Annic Nova, and at the time it was considered sort of a mythical starship, and there was a couple reported sightings across the spinward marches for the past previous years. And he was a sensor operator aboard his crew, so he stayed aboard his ship while the rest of the crew went aboard the Annic Nova. And then, without warning, the Annic Nova jumped away, leaving him completely alone and without his crew, and he finally managed to get back home. So this guy spent the last 15 years hunting for this elusive starship, and he's become obsessed with it, kind of like a Captain Ahab sort of character, but with a PhD. He shows the traveler a copy of his readings that he took when he discovered the ship originally, and this was a picture that I found online. I just printed it out and handed it to my players as their initial handout. And he says that he's been able to model all of the different locations from all the reported sightings over all these years, and using some fancy schmancy science and computer modeling, he's been able to figure out where the Annic Nova is probably going to arrive next. But all he needs is to get a starship to get him there to meet it so he can get aboard the ship and be able to salvage it before it tries to jump away again. Now, since he's a little short on funds, the revenge business is kind of expensive, he offers to split anything that they find aboard the ship, including the salvage for the ship itself, 50-50 with the entire party, which of course the ship is going to be worth millions.
Millions? Well, say no more, possibly crazy man. You have got my attention and a ride on my ship.
Since my group had a jump to ship at the time, it was actually the High and Dry from the High and Dry adventure, I had the location that the doctor was suspecting it be just inside of an adjoining but empty parsec of space. And that way, since they had a jump to ship, if they jumped there and they didn't find anything, they'd still have enough fuel to get back home or get to a system that did have a gas giant so they could refuel. Now, once they arrived and they did their initial scan, once their jump was complete, they did discover that the Annic Nova was there, but it was so far away that it still took a couple days of them traveling with their M drives in order to reach it. Once they got close enough to scan and observe the ship, I gave them this as a handout and described what they saw and the potential entrances that the computers found. Now, once they were aboard, everything went pretty much like normal that's in the module, but eventually I had a second ship arrive inside the system, and this was a previous ship that Dr. Numar had been traveling with some years before, and they'd spent 2 years together chasing the Annic Nova and rumors about it all across the Spinward Marches before this crew finally got sick of the Doctor and just kicked him out. But they still had all of his research and all of his information, so they had continued the hunt for the Annic Nova just without him. So this rival crew feels that they're owed the Annic Nova because they spent so much time and so much money trying to find it, and they personally really dislike this Doctor. So they're going to consider the player characters to essentially be claim jumpers that just came out of nowhere and snagged their prize that they've spent 2 years hunting for. Now their ship is still going to take a few hours to close in on the Annic Nova, and if the player characters do have somebody that's occasionally or constantly manning the sensors, they'll be able to see the ship long before it arrives. But if the player characters don't have anyone checking the sensors or don't have any alarms set up in case anybody shows up, it might be a little bit of a surprise when somebody starts knocking on the outside door. Now Dr. Numar is your wild card, and he's paranoid of this other crew, and if he's afraid that the player characters might get in a fight and lose with this other crew or might strike some sort of deal with these jerks that just showed up, he's going to go ahead and panic and take matters into his own hands. So he locks himself in the portside jump pod and begins firing up the jump drive. The Annic Nova's battery might not have enough juice to make the full jump 2, but it will have enough to make a jump 1. And because this is going to take a few minutes to initiate the ship, like I mentioned earlier, it gives the player characters that much time in order to stop him. Maybe they can talk him down, or maybe they can get the door open, or somebody could go outside to that other entrance and they could just space him from the outside and suck him out into the void. Otherwise, this jump is going to happen.
Hey Doc, could you power down those drives and come on out of there? Because I swear to God, you do not want me to come in there.
Now, speaking of jumps, I had several ideas of what might happen to the ship while it's inside of jump space. One, because the Annic Nova is powered by this giant solar collector, and it has 2 completely independent jump drives. There's a jump 2 and a jump 3 drive aboard the ship. I thought it might be cool that while it's going through the glowing bubble of jump space, that the solar collector is still collecting juice, and it's getting juice for the other jump drive. Not enough to fully power a jump, but maybe enough to knock a week off of the required charge time once it arrives. So that way it's kind of, powering one jump and then kind of drawing power for the next. The other thing that I had happen in jump space is the plants. The Central Passage is described as being overgrown with all these plants, but I figured, hey, these shouldn't be normal plants, they should be alien plants. And once they're flooded with all the light of the jump bubble, that's when they start acting weird. They start growing and pulsing and doing all sorts of strange things. The disease on board, I decided, wasn't a disease at all, but these plant spores. And once a person becomes infected with these spores to the point of death, the plant is going to animate their corpse, sort of, some sort of plant zombie. And these plant zombies just simply walk into the greenhouse passage, they crawl into one of the beds there, and then the plants erupt from their corpses and continue filling the passage, filling the circle of life. Sort of like that weird fungus that makes zombie ants. And the reason the bodies remained in the quarantine room is because they were locked in a room where there was no jump space light ever reached them, so they died before they were ever able to bloom, and that's why there are corpses there for the player characters to discover. Anyways, once the Annic Nova is in jump space, a few of these plant zombies are going to come rising out of the beds inside the greenhouse, many of which being Dr. Numar's former crew, and they're going to crawl out of these greenhouse beds and attack anybody that they find aboard. Now, of course, if any of the player characters at any point in the adventure prior to this maybe broke one of the windows and depressurized that floor, killing all the plants, or maybe they dug in the plants and they discovered the bodies and they destroyed the bodies before they entered jump space, they could do that, and that might thwart any sort of attack later on. But I think it's still kind of a cool possibility of happening, but it's never going to be a guarantee. I figure between the claim jumping crew, this mad doctor who's your wild card, and the possibility of plant monsters attacking them while they're in jump space, it could add a little bit of an action along with the investigation of exploring the ship, and it worked out pretty well for us. Overall, we had a lot of fun with Annic Nova. I love the weird mystery, and I really, really love this unique starship. Hopefully my handouts and suggestions, as well as any ideas that you might find in that linked message board, maybe those will help you out, because I really, really recommend this adventure.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff, like game reviews and how-tos, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, gamers, you have a great day. So how again does it move the ship?
It slides into the hole and thrusts.
I don't think it's big enough to do much.
No, the pinnace is a good size.
So it's not the size of the pinnace that matters, but how you use it.
Exactly.